My name is Dorothy Haynes, and I was 19 years old when I traded my typewriter for a pitchfork. It was the spring of 1941. The war had already swallowed my brother Thomas whole a euro. He was somewhere in North Africa, writing letters that arrived with words blacked out by censors. My father worked the docks in Bristol. My mother cleaned houses on Clifton Road. We were a city family, and the closest I had ever come to a farm was the vegetable patch my Nan kept behind her terrace in Bedminster, 3 tomato plants and a stubborn row of runner beans. When the notice came through the labor exchange asking for women to join the Women's Land Army, I did not volunteer out of patriotism. I volunteered because the girl I sat next to at the typing pool, a loud, cheerful girl named Vera, said she was going and she did not want to go alone. That was the honest truth of it. Vera was the kind of person who made you do things you would never do by yourself, and she had decided that we were going to feed Britain, and so we were. We were sent to a farm in Somerset, near a village called Shepton Mallet. The farmer's name was Mr. Albright, a wide man with a red face and very little patience. He had lost 2 farmhands to conscription and 1 to illness, and when he looked at Vera and me standing at his gate with our new green jumpers and our Land Army armbands, his expression said everything his manners would not allow him to say aloud. The first week I thought I would die. Not from the work itself, though the work was harder than anything I had imagined. I thought I would die from the cold. The bothy where we slept had a single iron stove, and the wind came through the gaps in the walls as though the walls were not there at all. We woke at 5 in the morning. We ate porridge that tasted of nothing. We were in the fields before the sun had decided whether or not to show up that day. Mr. Albright's wife, Edna, was a different kind of person entirely. She was small and quiet and she watched everything. On the 3rd evening, when I was sitting outside the bothy trying not to cry because my hands had blistered so badly I could not close them properly, she came and sat beside me without saying anything. She took my hands and looked at them, went back inside, and returned with a tin of something that smelled of lanolin. She rubbed it into my palms without a word. Then she said, "It passes. Give it a fortnight." And she went back inside. That was the longest conversation we had for the first month. She was right. It did pass. By July, my hands were different hands entirely. Hard where they had been soft, quick where they had been clumsy. I could set a fence post and I could drive the old gray tractor across the lower field without veering into the ditch. I learned to read weather from the sky in a way that felt almost like listening. I learned that cows are creatures of deep habit and that disrupting their routine produces a resentment that is wholly disproportionate to the disruption. I learned that Vera, for all her cheerfulness, was terrified of geese, and that this was very funny, and that she never stopped being terrified of them no matter how many months passed. There were 6 of us on the farm by August. Agnes had come from Glasgow and spoke so quickly I understood perhaps half of what she said but liked her immediately. Ruth was older, perhaps 30, and she had been a schoolteacher. She did not talk about why she had left teaching. We did not ask. On a farm, people kept the parts of themselves they needed to keep and let the rest go. There was not the space or the leisure for complicated unhappinesses. The harvests were the worst and the best of it. September of 1941, we worked 17 hours in a single day. My back locked up on me around the 14th hour and I stood in the middle of the field for a moment with my eyes closed, just breathing, wondering if the field would simply swallow me. Then Ruth walked past and knocked my shoulder with hers and I kept going. We did not know exactly where the food was going. We knew it was going somewhere urgent. Every now and again a government man would come out from Taunton and talk about tonnage and quotas and the importance of meeting targets, and Mr. Albright would nod and his face would go a shade redder, and after the government man left he would come into the field and work alongside us without speaking until his color returned to normal. I liked him for that. He could have stood and watched. He never did. In November, a letter came from my mother telling me Thomas had been wounded. Not critically, the letter said, as though this were a comfort, which I suppose it was. He was in hospital in Cairo. He would recover. She had written the letter 3 weeks before it reached me, and by the time I read it, his recovery was already well underway, but I did not know that, and I sat in the bothy with the letter in my blistered hands and felt the distance between a farm in Somerset and a hospital in Cairo stretch out inside my chest like something physical. Dara sat with me. She did not say anything particularly useful. She said things like "he'll be alright" and "your mum would have heard if it were worse," which were the kinds of things people said because the silence was worse than inadequate words. I understood this and was grateful for it. Thomas did recover. He came home in 1943 on a long leave and visited me on the farm. He stood at the gate in his uniform, the same gate where Vera and I had stood 2 years before in our new green jumpers, and he looked at me as though he were not entirely sure of what he was seeing. I had changed in ways I could not have explained to him and did not try to. He helped us bring in the hay that afternoon, working in his shirt sleeves, and Mr. Albright gave us all cider at the end of the day, which was the most generous thing I ever saw him do. I stayed on until the spring of 1945. The war ended in May and by September I was back in Bristol. The typing pool had a place for me. The city looked the same and completely different, the way things look when you have been away long enough to see what was always there. Dara went back to London. We wrote for years. Agnes went back to Glasgow and married a man who also farmed. Ruth I heard through Agnes much later had gone back to teaching. She had a classroom of her own in a village school in Dorset. I thought that was right. Ruth was made for classrooms. She just needed somewhere else to be first. I did not go back to Somerset for a long time. When I finally did, it was 1962. I drove down with my husband, who had never been a farmer and who listened patiently while I pointed at fields and told him things he could not have found interesting. Mr. Albright had died in 1958. Edna was still there, older, smaller, still watching everything. She remembered me. She made tea and we sat in the kitchen where she had once come to find me crying over my blistered hands, and we talked for 2 hours without stopping. Before I left she pressed another tin of that lanolin cream into my hands. My hands were soft again by then, city hands. But I took it. I still have it somewhere. I have never thrown it away. That is the story. We fed Britain. We fed it with our hands and our backs and our early mornings and our long, cold winters, and most of us did not think of it as heroism because we were too tired to think of it as anything at all. But the food went somewhere. Someone ate it. The country held together, and we were part of WWII. That is enough.